Hi, everyone, and welcome back to week 5 of our Joyful Journey series highlighting this fall 2024 season at Girls on the Run of Northern Virginia. This week, we are talking about one of my favorite topics, and I think a topic a lot of us think about, but maybe don't dive deep into a whole lot, and that's communication. So this week at practice, the girls are working with their coaches to learn about why communication is so important and how we can communicate well with others, and understanding that communication is truly the bedrock to any good relationship, whether it's building a new friendship, collaborating with your coworkers, or solving problems with your family. Communication is key. And I am thrilled to welcome Teaira Abston, who is joining us. Teaira is the owner and founder of Dreamcatcher Creative Studio that specializes in branding, web development, and consulting. So spot on for what we're talking about today. Teaira, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Ashley.
Awesome. So we know that you're the owner and founder of Dreamcatcher Creative Studio, focusing so much on marketing, branding, but tell us about your career, how you got to building Dreamcatcher, and the importance that communication plays in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't originally start off with being a brand or web designer. I actually kind of started down the path of working in corporate, doing project management and things of that nature. And I learned early on that I was way more creative than it allowed me to be. So I think over the course of trying different jobs and kind of seeing where I wanted to go, I pivoted my career to mostly focus on the creative industry. So that's kind of how I kind of pivoted a bit to be more so focused on Dreamcatcher. And it really, honestly, I think it happened right after my wedding because that was when I was able to really put everything into practice and design and so forth. And so it just allowed me to make that pivot more easier. And I had a transition from corporate to entrepreneurship. So yeah.
That's awesome. And communication playing a vital role since you are all about branding, and branding at the core of it is communicating a message. So how does that play into what you do day in and day out?
Yeah, so I have to communicate quite a bit. For me, it's making sure number one, I'm communicating with my potential clients, right? Making sure they understand like the value that we provide as an agency, because a lot of times you see other people out here that do very similar services. So that's number one. So ensuring we're in front of them, we're communicating different ways, whether it's email marketing, whether it's face to face networking, whether it is on social media and so forth. But another thing is making sure I'm communicating internally with my team. So the biggest thing for me is ensuring that I am able to clearly articulate to my team what the goals are for my clients, what their expectations are, and what they're really trying to convey when we are rebranding and creating their website and so forth. So if I'm not able to effectively do that, then it's really hard for my team to actually design and create messaging that aligns with where they're trying to go. So I just make sure that number one, I have different forms of communication. I have video that I use quite often in order for them to really see me and hear my voice. I also have things like Slack and email marketing or email, for instance, to ensure I'm kind of hitting all the different areas when I'm communicating with my people, my team, and then also my clients.
Yeah, Slack. That's a big one in our Girls on the Run office. We are always on that Slack channel too. And I love
Yes.
how you relate it back to your team, like communication being the bedrock for making sure that things run smoothly. And I think the same goes for our coaches and our girls, the entirety that they're at with their Girls on the Run team for their season. It
Yeah.
does go back to communication, how the coaches are communicating the lessons, how the girls are communicating and collaborating, working well together with one another. So that's awesome. So, diving into skills a little bit when it comes to communicator, what skill do you think plays the most vital role in being an effective communicator? And how can we practice cultivating that skill?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think a lot of people fail to like listen to understand, right? Versus like listening to respond back, whether it's a question, whether it's a comment. And so a lot of people fail to do the whole active listening piece, which I think is really important to have as far as skills go. But I think it's also assuring the person that you're communicating with, they understand how you're interpreting what they're telling you, right? So
Oh,
I always tell people now it's like if I think I understand something that, for instance, you want for your brand, I always try to respond back and say things like, I think you said, or am I interpreting this correctly? Or I try to show them examples of things that they mention so that we're on the same page, because things can get lost in translation. So I think that's a big one, is making sure you actively listen and assure the person that you're talking to basically understands that you understand the way they want you to.
I like that. So active listening is a really critical skill. And then being willing to give our own perception back to the person we're communicating with to make sure we're on the same page. I think a lot of people, active listening is such I feel like a buzzword these days, or
Yep.
always has been. Um,
Yep.
but it's that second piece of, okay, well, I heard you say X or Y. And then it allows for clarification if there is a difference of interpretation.
Yeah, especially in my line of work, because I hear some of the same things often, but depending on who it comes from, it can mean so many different things. Like, I want it to be modern. Well, what exactly does that mean to you? Because to me, modern means this. You know what I mean? So show me what you mean, because a lot of times that can go a long way in terms of how I'm interpreting something versus how you're giving it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And especially with something when it comes to a topic that's more ephemeral, like being creative, like
Yes.
designing something.
Yes.
Somebody
It's
like,
objective.
yeah, the modern example is perfect because your idea of modern, somebody else's idea of modern could
Mhm.
be on two completely different pages of
Yep.
two different books, not even the same
Yep.
book.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. So thinking about active listening and then communicating back your perception or your understanding, being the most important skill, what do you see as the biggest challenge in communication? Like, what's a big roadblock that comes up a lot? And what advice would you give to conquer that roadblock?
Yeah, I definitely think like miscommunication, or like assuming someone understands or has the same level of understanding as you, is a big roadblock. So, for instance, the example that we gave, just miscommunication or assuming, right? So, oftentimes I have to think back and say, like, we have different experiences, we have the generational things that come up. So I think that could be a huge roadblock in terms of assuming someone just understands what I'm saying, and just not remembering not to use like jargony kind of words that only I may be familiar with, but my client, because they've never maybe even dealt with this type of stuff before, they may not understand. So basically, starting from the ground up. So I always hear the term of like third grade level, very basic, so that you don't assume a person is way beyond in a certain level of understanding than not. So that's one of the keys that I think is important. But the other big thing that I see people not necessarily display is like emotional intelligence when it comes to a lot of things, right?
Mhm.
So if you're put in a situation where maybe you interpret things a certain way, and maybe it angers you or frustrates you, and you automatically respond rather than like taking that beat, right, taking a
Yes.
moment, walking away, coming back, it allows you to have more of a level head, or maybe even talking to someone else and asking like, hey, how did you interpret this? You know what I mean? It can cause things to kind of level set versus escalate. So I think emotional intelligence is a big one that can be a challenge in various situations, work, family, etc.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so awesome that you bring that up because so much of what we focus at on Girls on the Run is teaching those emotional intelligence skills.
Yep.
Girls, if you're listening, does that sound like stop and take a breather or press pause, which are tools you should have already learned by
I'm
now?
15. Yeah.
Yes, yes. But it's so true. So, biggest roadblocks, that miscommunication and the way that we can avoid that is really, let's start from the ground up together. Let's come at this from the same
Yeah.
exact same perspective, which I think forces us to practice empathy. It forces us to practice,
Absolutely.
curiosity of seeing something from somebody else's perspective. And
Yeah.
then having that emotional intelligence of, well, when do I need to take a break in communication and not have this snowball? We talk a lot that we have an entire workshop dedicated to emotional intelligence for
Oh,
adults.
that's good. That's
It's all
good.
about that. And it's so
Yeah.
important. It's great that the girls that are at Girls on the Run are learning these skills. Their coaches are having these skills reinforced for themselves as they teach it, but it's definitely something we all need.
Absolutely, because everybody, they don't grow up learning that. So it's important.
And something else you said that I really liked, in talking about the roadblocks and the miscommunication and starting from the same ground level is nobody, it goes back to that there's no idea is a dumb question. If somebody's asking a question,
Mm-hmm.
it's truly because they don't understand something. And it's so
Right.
funny. I was at practice this week and I, gave, hey, this is what we're going to do for the warm-up activity. And we
Yeah.
always ask before we go, does anybody have any questions? And sure enough, one of the girls on my team raised her hand. She asked a question and I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Thank you for asking that. That is a great clarifying point. Girls, let's make sure we do X during the warm-up. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And it just
Yeah.
reinforces that practice that never be scared to raise your hand, never be scared to ask for the clarification, because it will avoid those miscommunication pitfalls down the road.
Absolutely. That's a good point. I always tell people if you have any questions, let me know, or, don't hesitate to reach out because you want to make sure that you're on the same page.
Yes, 100%. And you
Yeah.
started to touch on a little bit, I want to dive deeper on the generational aspect of this, because at Girls on the Run, we're primarily working with elementary and middle school students. And then, of course, our volunteer coaches come from many different generations. On my team alone, I'm a millennial. I work with mostly other millennial women as my coaches, have like that cusp of Gen Z millennial, that zillennial. We have coaches that are definitely Gen Xers. We have some baby boomer coaches. So
Yep.
how does communication change across the generations, and how can we bridge those gaps as adults when we're working with kids?
That's a good one. And I think we're really learning this now in the
Mhm.
age of like social media, for example. It's just understanding that people communicate differently, period. Like generationally from different cultures, etc. And just being open to that and also understanding that where they communicate may be different. So if you think about like the baby boomer era, right, they're probably more likely to pick up the phone and call and want to talk to you, right? Versus maybe the younger generation, they're like, give me a chat bot, and they're more so they're quick and they want quick response versus doing the long term of like picking up the phone and that type of, or even texting, right?
Mhm.
So just being cognizant that the different generations have preferred ways of communicating, but then also figuring out how you can leverage that and tie that into your education and your teaching and so forth. Because people learn differently is one thing I tell people. People learn auditory, people learn from being like tactile, hands-on. People learn from reading. So being open to like, how will someone interpret this and can I give them alternative if they don't interpret it the right way, the other way. Like if you're reading something, maybe they need a video.
Mhm.
So prime example is like for me, I prefer auditory like learning and communication and things like that. I'm always listening to a podcast or always listening to a book, whereas other people they prefer the picking of the book, like the reading the actual words and the feeling of the book.
Mhm.
So it just really depends on how you interpret these, how you communicate, and I'm really cognizant of that, like working with my team and also my clients, because I have so many generations that I work with as well. I'm not going to introduce Slack to everyone. Maybe it doesn't work for every generation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. It's
Yeah,
again going back to meeting people exactly where they're at and
absolutely.
building a solid foundation. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
So gonna wrap up, considering still thinking along this lines of communication when it comes to the generations. So what advice would you give to our younger generation? So let's say it's these girls that we're working with in elementary and middle school to help them
Yeah.
become better communicators.
Mhm.
What can we as adults in their lives do to help them cultivate those skills?
I think we could get them outside of like their comfort zone. So they're probably more used to like what I mentioned, the social media, the texting their friends, and all those types of things. So I think if we put them in more situations where they're allowed to actually practice more face-to-face communication, whether it's extracurricular activities, things like Girls on the Run, even like opportunities to speak publicly, I think they'll get more comfortable with different forms of communication. And I think it can serve them really good, like now throughout their life. So, all the way to their career, they'll be more, I think they'll be stronger with communication if we start now. So basically putting them in different ways that can actually do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Don't hold
Mhm.
them back. Don't limit them to just one form of communication and just kind of write it off as, oh, well, it's Gen Alpha now and they're only going to do things by social media. Like, no, push them to have that classic interaction with their peers or even with adults in appropriate situations to learn how to cultivate that skill.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, even thinking back to like how I used to play outside, and I feel like now I don't see it quite as often. Like I feel like a lot of our children are inside, they're on the tablets, they're on the TV, and it's like even that can help with like communicating because you're actively playing with other kids and you're getting more so that face-to-face kind of interaction that I think, like I mentioned, carries you throughout your life and you just feel more comfortable in settings like that.
100%. Can't agree more.
Yeah, yeah.
Teaira, it has been a joy having you join us for our joyful journeys this week and enlightening us to some more, a deep dive on communication. So you have been wonderful in giving us insight and expertise, and we are so appreciative to share it with our Girls on the Run community.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I absolutely love what you guys are doing. So I really am appreciative of leaving me and featured on the show. Thank you.
You're so welcome. All right, everyone, that's it for today's episode. We'll be back next week with a brand new topic going along with our fall 2024 Girls on the Run of Northern Virginia season.
This episode of Joyful Journeys is brought to you by Girls on the Run of Northern Virginia.